Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are extremely lucky to have on Dr. Suzanna Russell. Susanna, thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. Thank you for having me on.
If you could kindly give us a little bit of background about who you are and what you do, that would be super helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, perfect. So, bit of context about me. I'm based in Brisbane, up in the Sunshine State, where I love living. Have done so for the last 10 years or so. I was actually born in the UK and spent a fair bit of time between there and here in different parts of Australia growing up, but definitely found sort of home here, I think. In terms of what I do, I spend most of my days collaborating with other researchers and some practitioners to basically answer applied research questions centering around sort of human performance. It's a very broad term in terms of what human performance encapsulates.
Well,
But I have
start
a
to
bit
give us
of
a little bit of an idea of how you start to do that, because as you said, it's broad, but it's such an interesting area, and I think some of your research starts to look at that, which is really cool.
Yeah, so background wise, I sort of, as a path that many people take, did a exercise and sports science undergrad degree. Spent a bit of time working in sport in sort of an analyst role actually, and sort of came into this area of wanting to do a PhD around athlete mental fatigue. And being really interested, I guess, in that sort of more holistic or bigger picture side of things around, whether that sort of exists for athletes, how they experience it, and what we can basically do in applied sport to help manage that better. Along the pathway, I guess, like I've sort of worked in a few different areas, including sort of policy roles and sports tech and those things, which has sort of, I guess, helped create like an integrative and an overview and approach, which I think really helps in the research setting. But essentially, sort of, I just try and use those skills during different tasks each day to answer questions that practitioners, or that we can help practitioners with, or even help everyday people with as well.
Mm. The first question that we had for you is a very big question, but what is mental fatigue?
The hard-hitting one to start with. You ask a few
We didn't
different
want to make
people,
it too easy for you.
you'll get a
Can
few
you just
different answers on
consolidate your
this.
life's work into 2 or 3 sentences, please?
So, I mean, it's like it is contentious as well, and different people have different perspectives on it, but it's sort of defined as a psychobiological state. So obviously that has psychological and physiological aspects to it, which is deemed to be induced by a prolonged, again, what prolonged means differs for different people, but period of demanding cognitive activity. And some people sort of like to add, and I sort of do agree with this perspective, that requires like sustained mental efficiency. So you're engaged in that task for the period of time. And I think in terms of what mental fatigue is and framing it around sport, that was one of the biggest questions that we had. So a lot of the research was traditionally done in sort of like driving or aviation or more like office work type settings, where maybe that didn't really reflect the tasks that athletes did on a daily basis, or athletes or coaches, or sort of actually a lot of people that work in a day-to-day setting. So looking at how athletes actually experience it and what some of the things that might be inducers for them. And I think something that I kind of think when I saw the question about, what is mental fatigue, it's like, well, also important to sort of discuss mental recovery, and that sort of relating the process back to regaining that balance and replenishing that cognitive resource, much in a restorative way that we would try and do with physical fatigue and physical recovery too.
You mentioned there, like, obviously, recovering, but what are the things that you actually do and can measure that suggest that there is, say, some sort of cognitive load or mental fatigue that you're experiencing, or you're measuring? As someone who works in the field, are there things that you can measure to say, yes, it's clear that this person is under some level of mental fatigue?
Yes, there is, and there's lots of different things. And again, I think the interpretation of like multiple streams of information, which I actually think applies to a lot of concepts, not just mental fatigue, is really important in how we understand and interpret the state that someone's in, and also accounting for the fact that there's different inducers for different people and different levels of tolerance and all those kind of factors.
Yeah.
But essentially, like, it's broken down into the fact that you can determine it like subjectively, behaviorally, or sort of neurophysiologically, and they're the three streams, I guess, that you can look at different sources of information through. So there's some indications that we can see changes in EEG activity, so brain activity, basically, when someone is, or that's an indicator that they might be feeling mentally fatigued. Becomes very complicated when you then add physical fatigue into that too, because we see some changes there. But a bit more practically, I guess, what we tend to look at is those subjective and behavioral responses, which don't always necessarily like align with each other directly. So we're not always seeing a direct correlation between the two of them, but they're sort of more closely related. So subjectively, how someone reports how they feel. So that might be like on a visual analog scale, for example, around mental fatigue, and then things like our response time and our response accuracy and the sort of trade-offs there, particularly with certain cognitive domains or aspects that we might deliberately target there. That's how we might start to determine if someone is experiencing mental fatigue.
And what effect does that seem to have on their performance? Because obviously you can see, someone might be, and I say this even, working with athletes, someone might be, say, very stressed from and have a lot of cognitive load from, say, academic stress, say exams or something like that. How does that then translate into when they step on the field? What actually do you see, and what can you potentially measure that gives you an indication that has maybe negatively impacted their performance? Because obviously the follow-up to that will be some of the things that you mentioned about mental recovery strategies. But yeah, what can we observe there that says, oh yeah, that has impacted their performance?
Yeah, I think I kind of want to preface this by saying that the most body of evidence, as we see with a lot of literature and research, is to the point so far more been done primarily in sort of a laboratory or theoretical setting. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a lot more people try and make an effort and intention to translate that to an applied setting, with varying levels of success and quality, I would say, which happens, I think, when something becomes more of a popular topic. But essentially, we see an impact on aspects of performance. So the first sort of like boom in this literature, there was literature done many years ago about this topic, but came after sort of a systematic review on the impact on physical performance came out. So the strongest body of evidence that we see there is sort of an impact on more endurance-based performance. So that might be like cycling time trial, time to exhaustion, 3K, 5K running distance, a yo-yo intermittent recovery test, like those kind of things that people probably used to seeing or undertaking or working with their athletes. So generally we'd see not necessarily a change in physiological markers, like heart rate's not necessarily influenced by mental fatigue, for example, other than they're working less hard, so therefore the heart rate might be slightly lower. But we see that impact on the outcome of performance. And then in addition to that, again, the evidence is kind of built that we have more evidence around like technical and tactical involvements, how things like the number of tackles that are successful or the number of errors that someone makes, things like free throws in basketball, AFL kicking accuracy has been explored. Like those kind of more decision-making and skill-related aspects have also started.
And I know this sounds probably like a dumb question, but does it always, or is the tendency always that it's in a negative direction? Like, is there ever been signs that someone's, cognitive load is high, yet they make more three throws? I can't even say that. Three throws.
Not a stupid question at all, actually. And I wouldn't say there's been any evidence that said it's had a positive impact, but the degree that they're really, that in particularly laboratory-based settings, that people are fatiguing like individuals too. Like if anyone, I shouldn't say this because we obviously want to recruit people, but if people are asked to do a mentally fatiguing protocol for 60 to 90 minutes, you are not the most popular person after someone's had to do it, because it is really, really challenging to be involved with. So generally, I think we'd say that particularly in the research or lab setting, we've seen a degree of mental fatigue that's been induced that then has resulted in those negative performance. In some cases, you've seen no impact, so just sort of stayed the same or same as a control. particularly more around like the, a one-off all-out or maximal anaerobic or, really short-based task. I think we need to look at that more in terms of like a repeated basis of doing those tasks again and again, because that's probably more reflective in the field. But I think a good way to think of it as well is around like, there's a level that you want in reference to your question of like mental activity and mental engagement and stimulation. So it's not always bad to be cognitively engaged with the activity prior to. It's not like we need to avoid it at all costs. It's about getting that balance and stimulus right, much like we see with physical training as well.
And a question I have for you then, because you made the point about mental fatigue and say like doing a all-out anaerobic performance not having an impact. And the question I have is about the relationship between mental fatigue and central nervous system fatigue. Because when I think about, say, sprinters, and John can comment more on this because he's a sprint coach himself, but it seems that inhibition or reduction in central nervous system output from central nervous system fatigue has a big impact on short all-out performance. But you're suggesting that mental fatigue doesn't. So what is the relationship between mental fatigue and central nervous system fatigue? Or is there a relationship?
I would say we don't really know yet, other than there has been a bit of research that sort of indicated that mental fatigue induced in the way that it typically has been in research doesn't reduce the capacity to recruit working muscles, kind of in the way that you've just explained. And also that links a bit back to this, which I don't think I've probably communicated that well yet, is that this proposed mechanism around the impact of mental fatigue is more to do with potentially adenosine accumulation in the brain, and then the impact that has on neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, so dopamine, noradrenaline, serotonin, things that we do see related to CNS fatigue. But really,
so the main more caffeine then, is it?
Yes. The main moderator, well, this is basically that perception of effort seems to be the thing that's limiting performance, rather than maybe some like physical drive. So caffeine is one very successful strategy when used in the right context, in the right dosing, in the right timing, that seems to work for people to overcome.
No, it's interesting to say that, because I think it was last week or the week before, there was a discussion that was had between sort of QAS and Swiss and Athletics Australia, and they were talking about central nervous system and mental fatigue. And I asked that question. I don't know that I got the best answer, because I see them as being quite different, even though they might impact each other. But they kind of alluded to maybe the fact that they do influence each other. And I wasn't sure because I hadn't seen that mix yet. So I don't know that there is an answer just yet, because I think it's something that you guys are still obviously exploring to some level of depth.
Well, actually, just on that too, you mentioned before about mental fatigue and looking at, say, subjective measures of mental fatigue versus EEG analysis, and you said they're not always necessarily correlated. So is that correct? So if that's the case, are there any actual physiological markers that you use that are strongly correlated to the subjective perception or subjective capacity of an individual?
Yeah, not really. So that's, I think, a lot of the inconsistency as well and it's hard, right? Is it the differences in methodological approaches that people have taken? Is it the differences in technologies that people are using, even between, differing products and brands? Is it the differences in actually individuals and their exposure and their experiences and their I think in terms of answering that, we need a bigger and bigger database to help us understand that. That's, like a multi-site effort. No one researcher, I think, is going to answer that. But it's also the case of does one marker, I don't know, I'm a bit of a perception, is one marker ever the answer for everything? Probably not. Is one marker ever going to fully encapsulate mental fatigue and what someone's experiencing? I would say we're probably looking for something we're never going to find, if that's... And it's hard because practitioners often want that and they need that because they're under time pressure and they, want some clarity and certainty, but it's not necessarily that straightforward, and particularly with the individual variability that we see, even in quite homogeneous samples, it's quite a fascinating area from that perspective.
Is there any research looking at indicators for someone's susceptibility to mental fatigue, like for instance, personality profiling or the history of completing a particular cognitive task? Are those correlates at all to mental fatigue?
Yeah, this is another really good and interesting question that I think is being researched like a lot more by people, or it's starting to be considered, is because we see those individual differences, like what can be leading to that. I mean, I definitely sort of would preface this with that, yeah, I don't have a psychology or a psychiatrist type background. So in terms of like personality factors, or that's sort of a challenging thing to answer, but there does seem to be modifiable factors that we see in individuals, or like traits that we might see in people as well, that could influence how we experience mental fatigue, so how mentally fatigued we get when we're exposed to what is a mentally fatiguing task, and also how well we tolerate that mental fatigue, so how well we can perform when we're actually experiencing or we have had mental fatigue induced.
What traits have you sort of started to see some association with?
Yeah, so there's some good research by Martin and colleagues from University of Canberra that's sort of looked at things like occupational demand, so what someone does in their day-to-day job and environment, and then sort of their participation in sport and exercise, your level of even like cardiorespiratory fitness, and that they can kind of maybe be protective about how you then respond or experience mental exertion and then respond in a physical task, which, I mean, it logically makes sense. Like, I think if you think about people that you know that you might describe as being like, oh, well, they're quite resistant to mental fatigue, they probably use their brain quite a lot in their job, and quite often probably train in the morning or in the afternoon after they have used their brain a lot in their job. And I know that sounds a really simple way to put it, but I do think there's probably something to, much like we'd expect with everything, you apply a stimulus to something, you get a response.
Yeah, I think it's very much in that model. This stress that we're exposed to, as long as the magnitude of that stress is appropriate, we will adapt to it sufficiently. And I don't think there's enough discussion about this across like all of the different types of stresses that we are exposed to. It doesn't matter what they are. The human body is extremely adaptable. The thing that it makes me think, because an area that I think has gained, and this is going to be controversial to say, but too much popularity is recovery. Right? I think people don't actually build their capacity by more exposure. They just try and recover from being poorly adapted to the task that they're being exposed to. So rather than saying, oh, I actually need to get better at dealing with X amount of cognitive load, they say, no, I'm just going to avoid those tasks in the lead up to anything so that I don't, go in mentally fatigued. And to me, it's both. It's not one is the answer. You want to have both strategies in place, but you shouldn't be scared to expose yourself to more at the appropriate time and over the appropriate, magnitude, so that you can, I can actually deal with a bit more stress from work, or, whether it's emotional stress or academic stress, so that I'm not, performing poorly in my, say, sport task, or even in my work environment, because I've got these other stresses. And sorry to keep rambling, but we actually just had another discussion with a researcher who's saying she's newly a mother, and she was saying her ability to deal with that stress has actually expanded enormously over time, even though early on she was like, oh wow, I'm really tired, I'm having a lot of sleep deprivation and all of these things, but now she's saying, oh, I'm actually a bit more used to it. And to me, that's like the perfect example of like the increased exposure leads to you actually having more capacity for that task.
Yeah, no, 100%. I really agree with that. And it's interesting that you say, because mothers are like, when you talk about mental fatigue, they're like, oh, I know what that feels like.
Welcome to my world. Yeah.
yeah. They're like, oh, try being a mum. And it's really interesting. Like, I mean, I see it in my sister who's got a 2-year-old now, and it's the same. It's like the amount that they're processing and dealing with. It's a great example of it. But you do adapt. And I completely also agree with the concept of like, with a lot of people, I'm like, well, what are you actually recovering from? What stimulus have you given your body that's requiring that recovery? Because it probably, that's probably another conversation, but it probably doesn't match, like your recovery behaviors aren't matching the load that you've applied. And if you're wanting to get some adaptation about that, like, and around the mental fatigue space as well, I think when I first started years ago looking at this area, is this concept of like, oh, mental fatigue is always bad and you want to avoid mental fatigue at all costs. And that's not the case at all. Like, we actually want to experience it. Athletes will experience it in training and competition. They're put in settings in competition with lots of new stimuli that we're never going to be able to, well, I shouldn't say never, that it'll be challenging to replicate really like how they experience that stimulus. So we can't just remove it and expect them then to perform in those settings when they arrive.
Can I ask then, sorry, I know I keep jumping in, but can I ask, is that something that you have worked in your roles where you've been in team settings or you're in these sort of performance environments where you're looking for opportunities to expose people to stresses, knowing that they are going to need them in the future? And then an example that I would give is, for instance, I'm lucky enough to be able to travel at times with my athletes to international competitions. And one of the things that I did last year was I took a couple of athletes that they weren't preparing for anything in particular, but I wanted them to get exposed to the travel and knowing what it was like to be, catching trains and moving here and doing that and
different time zones,
and living out of a bag and all of that kind of thing, because cognitively that is a really different load that they haven't experienced. And I did that on purpose, knowing that in future years they will need that experience. And I don't know whether I have heard some people talk about it, but is that something that, as someone like yourself who is much more versed in this than I is saying to performance staff, you need to go and find more stressful stimuli for these people, because us just doing training at the sporting ground and then throwing them into a crowd of 100,000 people, it's no surprise that they are being overstimulated here and not being able to deal with this.
Yeah. No, I think definitely. And I think in some realms in this space, like, I think it's really important to give coaches credit that they're aware of those things and that they do create environments that are often uncomfortable or new or novel for their athletes. And then there's also this sort of scarcity mindset of like, no, they need to perform in every setting. It's like, well, every setting isn't a qualifier or every setting isn't going to determine, I actually think that approach, particularly with younger athletes and exposing them, is really important, because there's lots of things that contribute to performance, but if they know how to, run their race, or they know how to perform their skill, that's not going to change. It's how they're sort of adapting to those other environmental things. And it was quite a few years back now, but one of my first PhD studies was like a qualitative interview study. And I just remember being really surprised at elite cricketers and a few other sports, but I remember it really specifically from cricket telling me, like, some of the things that we find super mentally fatiguing are, we don't know what hotel, like, I'm going to be at. I don't know what the environment's going to be like in that country. I don't know what food I'm going to be getting. Like, obviously the dietitians are trying everything to provide what they can, but they can't guarantee anything. And trying to get them to sort of be exposed to that at a younger age and understand, like, actually, when I'm not given what I expected, I can adapt and I can still cope with that scenario and perform, is probably a better, longer life lesson. It doesn't mean you get the acute performance, and that can be problematic for some people and they can see that as a negative thing. But yeah, helping build, I guess, the overall profile, particularly when athletes in some cases have to travel by themselves or with they don't have the same support team when they're going away. And I don't know, within Australia as well, some people might not have gone overseas much prior to having to go overseas for an event. So yeah, I think they're all really important things to think about and try and nudge coaches and practitioners to include, and athletes to think of the things themselves that they find fatiguing and deliberately target them rather than run away from them.
It seems to be a topic that we've discussed a bit recently, and that is developing that comfort with uncertainty. And that seems to be something that you're really emphasizing here in its relationship to mental fatigue, because the reality is we don't actually like discomfort or like unfamiliarity, and you actually need to expose someone through putting them in situations that they're unfamiliar with to make sure that they can actually cope with it. Because the reality, particularly in high performance, there's a lot of different settings and circumstances where you're confronted with a situation that may be unfamiliar or novel.
Yeah, I think definitely, like, that's part of the beauty of sport, right, is that we don't know what's going to happen. And that, I think, for athletes, like, is something that, yeah, if they can see as an opportunity and something to embrace because of their experiences of learning to cope. And I mean, it's the same for your everyday person as well. Like, you can look at things in two different ways in terms of being a new and novel stimulus. And yes, it might be fatiguing to start and it might be complicated and it might be hard to understand, but in the long run, that's, I guess, going to make you better, or being challenged can be a really good thing. But I think obviously it's also about periodizing that and making sure it's happening at the right times and not around the peak competition that we do need to perform for, or when school exams are also on with development athletes, or, things are going on with contracts and family and that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Is that something that you see in your exposure to high performance or sports performance, where coaches and staff will think about planning and preparing physical attributes and markers, but also then mental as well? And actually, like you mentioned, then actually timing that around when there are sort of key performances, because you obviously don't want to create too much cognitive load or stress around times when they do need to have peak performance.
Yeah, I think it's like a lot of people do have awareness of the fact that it's not just about physical loading. Obviously, there's different people with different roles that have more exposure time, and don't get me wrong, physical loading is a very important key. There's no point being cognitively resistant to fatigue if you've got no physical abilities. So
I'm ready.
Otherwise, we'd
Ready
all
for
be
this
athletes.
MMA fight.
But yeah, I think there is a lot of, and we've got example. There's sort of some work that's been done where, in certain training camps, the aim has been, it's not about making them perform, it's about selection and putting them under pressure, seeing how people perform in different ways when they are really fatigued, because often females as well have to compete in really congested tournaments. So what does that look like, and how do they cope with that and perform under that scenario? Yeah.
The thing I wanted to, do you know, does it vary is there research or is there any evidence that you've got even in your experiences of it varying whether you tell people this is going to be stressful, right? Like say we're going to, training camp and they know it's going to be stressful versus just throwing them in the deep end. And like you might even say to them, okay, if you were to give them that information, we're going to throw you in the deep end. There's going to be variable kind of situations you're going to have to navigate. Does it actually change the way in which the outcomes that you get? Because it makes me think, even obviously, you mentioned these cognitive load tasks that you give people that, 60 or 90 minutes of something that's mentally fatiguing. They obviously know they're doing that task. So does that influence, for instance, whether they know that the task is fatiguing or not, or they're going to be exposed to, a stressful, mentally fatiguing task?
Like, I mean, anecdotally, this is like, yes, I think so. And I think particularly there's sort of, I guess we have some questions around like, okay, they know they're meant to be doing a mentally fatiguing class. Are they going to answer that they're more mentally fatigued? And therefore, like, there's some studies that we've done in applied settings that are more blinded. Like, it's sort of shared with them ethically that we're looking at their performance and wellness, and that mental fatigue isn't a focus of that study. But it actually, it is, so that we don't sort of bias them and get those responses that we think they are trying to answer the way you want them to. And I do think anecdotally, I think there's a lot to this concept of, informing people. We appreciate and we know this is going to be a tough period, and that's deliberate. Like, we know, and we're sort of, I guess, here with you on that journey, and we want to see like how you respond to that. And I guess does that seem to
benefit? Does that seem to benefit them by doing that? That you have seen even anecdotally? Or do you think it doesn't really make a difference?
Anecdotally, I think it does make a difference. And particularly in like a team sports setting, when people share that experience between each other, I think it does. And this is sort of a bit left field, but there's evidence around sleep. So if you tell someone slept terribly and you tell them they slept well, they'll perform better on a cognitive task than if they slept well and you tell them they slept terribly, right? So the belief factor in things is really quite important. I would love to do like, blind it. It's hard to blind someone if they're doing a mentally fatiguing task or not, because, but like in that sort of area in terms of, and we have sort of got some studies coming up that are designed in a way that's like, people might not think it's a mentally fatiguing stimulus, but it sort of is, or, vice versa. And I think that will be really interesting in terms of how you frame things. And it's the same with physical training. That's often communicated to get buy-in and to get intent. Like, we know this is going to be challenging and we want it to be challenging. And there's probably, I mean, again, not from a psychology background, I don't know, but there's probably, I think anecdotally, at least a lot to that in terms of the athlete space, particularly in team sports.
Speaking of left field questions, one question just came to my mind, which I don't know if you've
Oh, God.
thought about this, is the relationship between mental fatigue and flow state. Because we seem to be hearing a lot about this concept of flow state and how people can get into a flow state and perform at a really elevated level for a prolonged period of time. And maybe I'm not sure if there's any research on this, or maybe it's more just an anecdotal thing. Do you see that people who can actually achieve that flow state reduce the amount of mental fatigue that they get? Or and maybe even conversely, like, if you actually really build up someone's ability to deal with stressful situations, like say in sport, does it allow them to access that flow state more easily when they perform at a high level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, like, I don't know the answer to that in that I haven't seen any research that specifically looks at it. But in terms of, like, when you think about performances, so say on a cognitive task, arguably when someone is performing better, like they've got better response accuracy and shorter response timing, they're in a better performance and arguably flow, whatever that like is termed as, state. And I do think that, like, there is then a cost to that in that, like, you can achieve that for X period of time, but you need to think about then the recovery that's required, I guess, following that experience. And often I think people find it within work, like you can work for long blocks or really productive blocks, and then following that is a less productive block, or you need to give your brain basically the ability to go and have restorative time like elsewhere. But I think there definitely is, something, and tasks which are like mundane are also fatiguing, right? So something that people, if you're enjoying a flow state task, or per se, whatever like that looks like, but if you're enjoying and you're engaged with a task, that's going to feel probably less mentally fatiguing than completing a task that you're finding really boring and you're having to stay and, I guess, actively involve yourself in, rather than feeling like you're just naturally involved in it. And I think the same, this is a long drawback, but when you talk to athletes about feeling mentally fatigued within like their training setting, it's like when we're doing the same drill again and again and again, and there's no change in performance, like no one's achieving what they want to achieve, we're just repeating it and the coach keeps telling us to repeat it. I find that really mentally fatiguing. Whereas, like, if they're repeating it but they're improving and progressing as a team, they'll report that that's not as mentally fatiguing. So that's probably an example from the performance setting that relates.
You got a question, John?
Oh, no, I was just going to, obviously, I've done a little bit of looking into that. I think one of the things that's interesting, like the states in which people reach flow is heavily related to the brainwave activity. And it seems to be associated with a period of actual struggle that requires and then induces, say, like noradrenaline release. And then that, you actually being able to go through that struggle of that mentally, or whether it's difficult or fatiguing task, actually is part of the process to get into a flow state. So the interesting thing is, like, whether people actually stick with that or whether they don't is probably something that I don't know whether if you say to them, okay, stick with this for a little bit, this problem that you're trying to solve, there's often, as you mentioned, like some value that I've seen in like then removing yourself from that task for a period of time. And like a really simple example of this that people have, say if you have a problem that you're dealing with, and I think we've all had this, where you are thinking about a problem, you can't quite work out how you want it to work, and then you go for a walk, or you're driving along because you got to get somewhere, and then all of a sudden the ideas start to flow. And that supposedly is part of that whole process where this is a bad analogy, but sort of you need to let it marinate, and part of that is actually part of reaching those states. So whether you're willing to push through that difficulty is part of reaching some of those performance capabilities.
That's an interesting sort of question. Sorry, I was just going to say around mental fatigue work too, in terms of like methodological design, is like people adjust to the task and it becomes easier because they sort of find a way, which is something that we've discussed. And it's like, so then you have to make the task responsive to how they're performing on the task, right? Like, which then doesn't make it standardized between people, but it's standardized to the individual. And then the cognitive load, like it's a big challenge and debate area. But that is like a good example, I think, of making that stimulus harder, because they've basically overcome the first challenging part and now feel, maybe not being fatigued in the way that we want them to, because they're actually managing what was originally a fatiguing stimulus as a manageable task. So, yeah.
We've spoken a lot about this idea of, perception being a major factor in how fatigued someone feels, particularly mentally. And I know that Jack sent this through, but, some of the work by Roger Anoka proposes classifying fatigue, particularly in a performance for, say, sport, as being perceptual or performance fatigue, and putting them into these different subcategories. So you get some idea of whether there is actually, more subjective changes that people are reporting, or even objective changes you see in terms of the actual performance. Do you see this kind of thing as being useful? Because one thing that I've noticed a lot is people like to define down to, this peripheral system is fatigued, this structure is fatigued, this will recover quicker than this one,
and even making the assumption that the peripheral and central systems, whatever that means, are separate things, and not to mention then even thinking about then the, like we mentioned at the start, like the physiological versus the psychological or emotional states. Because you would think that there is a lot of interaction between all these different systems or subsystems.
So is it useful to maybe see them more as, whether they actually cause fatigue versus whether you just think that you feel more tired? Or is that too much of a simplification from your reading of it?
Yeah, this is like a challenging question, because I think in some cases there is use to it, but I think it's not reflective of how it actually exists. So it's like a framework or process that people can use to break it down and maybe manage or look at different aspects, but it's not necessarily actually representative of how fatigue works. And I'm not saying that I know how fatigue works. If I did, I'd have lots of answers to a lot of people, but why
do you say you don't think it's how what makes you say that? What in your sort of current structure of how you look at it gives you that inclination?
Yeah, I think like that aspects of fatigue can be like largely separate in terms of potentially their like cause or potentially how they manifest for someone. But then actually they all interrelate, even though they might be largely separate columns. So I think it's really hard to sit there or to say like this belongs in this category and this belongs in this category, because it's not necessarily like for that person how it is all actually working. And I think this is a lot of why I like or have a belief that when subjective measures are asked well and understood well, they're really important, and they can supplement objective information really well, because they really reflect. And there was a qualitative paper released, I think, a year or so ago, basically about how subjective and objective measures can work in the elite sporting environment. And the fact that subjective measures basically give information that we can't necessarily obtain just from an individual objective measure is because that subjective allows for that integration that only the athlete can experience or communicate, and we don't necessarily have a tool that like indicates everything, or we need multiple different tools. Yeah.
Well,
and I have a really... Go on.
No, keep going.
No, I have like a analogy that I kind of came up with and I presented when I was over in the US. And I'm not sure if it really works, but it works like in my head around like fatigue. And it's a really simple way of trying to explain that like all the different aspects of fatigue are a bit like when you're like painting a fence. And this actually came to me when I was painting my own fence. But it's like, yeah, always thinking about work, I guess. Or like we've discussed before, in different settings, ideas coming to you. But it's like, so we might think like physical fatigue, for example, or that kind of neuromuscular fatigue that we might experience, or even like a biomechanical stress or something, is like that front panel of the fence that like, from afar, it's really obvious that is or isn't painted. And it's kind of the first thing that you might go and like address. And then sort of when you're trying to like get the sides or like the little nooks between where different parts join, you need different tools to be able to do that. You can't just use the big paintbrush. You need, masking tape and smaller other brushes, for example. And the way I kind of think about it is like we're all trying to paint, all these different people that want to look at different aspects of fatigue. We're all trying to paint the fence, but we all need to get on board that the whole fence needs to be painted, or different panels of it need to be assessed in order to get that overall fatigue picture. So we can't just address biomechanical fatigue and not affect not expect that to have an impact on other aspects, or we can't just fuel someone and not, expect that then if they're able to perform at a high capacity, that we don't need to think about other parts of loading or cognitive fatigue that might be causing, or the way their body is physically responding. So I kind of think, like, I always look at it from a very holistic approach of like, yep, I've got an interest in one area of fatigue, but I think you're pretty arrogant to say, yep, my area of fatigue is the only one that is going to influence performance. And also that, there's different weightings at different times for different people that basically might impact. And prefacing those terms and separating them out helps us understand probably mechanistically a bit more. But as a whole picture, that's not how it really looks when we look at an athlete.
No, and I think the big thing really to take from that is so many of these measures are proxies really for understanding this very complex, entity of fatigue. That's interesting. You're talking, I think, I know the article you were talking about, looking at the subjective versus objective measures. And interestingly, I remember that article talking more about subjective measures typically being a better correlate than objective measures. And, and it makes a lot of sense because so much of what we experience is based on our perception. You could have measures of, neuromuscular fatigue, but you feel great. And ultimately the thing that you care about as an individual is how you feel.
Yeah. And I think as well, it's about like, okay, how do we get value out of, I'm not saying we shouldn't use objective measures, we should, and that helps us understand things as well, and mechanistically that helps us inform things. But it's also like, if you put effort into framing those subjective measures really well and building those relationships and giving adequate feedback off those measures so people continue to answer them well, then that should, serve you well to get an integrated picture of what that athlete's feeling and experiencing. And it doesn't always have to be high tech and high cost things. It can be a really rigorous process of implementing something simple that can actually be of use.
You mentioned before, thinking about how we can, say, improve mental fatigue. And one of the things is about exposure to a particular task or novel task, because that helps you to deal with novelty, so to speak. Are there any other particular things that we can look at to help improve mental fatigue? One thing I'm thinking of is the area of nootropics, where, there seems to be a big industry now about certain supplementation to help with your cognitive function. Do they actually have a potential benefit in improving mental fatigue? Mental capacity?
I actually found this question quite interesting because a lot of people in the sports space will ask, how do I fix it? Not like acutely. How do I mitigate it? How do I stop it impacting my performance tomorrow? Not necessarily what way can I build capacity or develop my athletes to tolerate, which I don't know. I just thought that was a really interesting way of first asking that question.
Well, I think that's a big problem in general when it comes to healthcare and medicine, because everyone's looking for the quick fix, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's not necessarily that quick fix can, caffeine's a good example. It can be helpful in certain circumstances, but if you're having to take that at 9 p.m. at night, you're going to have consequences on your sleep, right? Which then is, a cycle that we can enter. But there is some evidence around, I think, some supplements, but mostly what I have seen is caffeine and creatine are the ones that have more of an evidence base than some of the things. And particularly supplement wise, you need to think about the dosages in what's offered and are they of an adequate level, or can they get that from actual food as well. But there is sort of some concepts around, can we get athletes to deliberately engage in cognitively fatiguing tasks at specific times that's periodized and planned. And there's apps that have been built around this concept of brain endurance training. So either concurrently with our physical activity, integrating some of these cognitive activities, or prior to our physical session, integrating them and deliberately fatiguing, or even post-session, there's been some evidence. And they've got fairly solid findings in general population. And in terms of I think they've therefore got capacity for elderly populations and that kind of space and helping build resilience there. But we need to do a bit more work on whether that actually for athletes translates, because arguably athletes are already exposed to a high physical and cognitive demand concurrently, and maybe they're more resistant. It's just how do those protocols look that has a good outcome for an athlete. But I definitely think they're are things you can do, and there are things you can do acutely in terms of measurement and even exposure to like various scents and things that people have systematically reviewed and indicated, and breathing protocols and restorative environments, for example, that sort of have some at least anecdotal and some small case study evidence around them, that athletes and practitioners can definitely try and see what works for them.
You mentioned earlier the recovery things, and we said that sometimes people are recovering from things that aren't really that fatiguing. But if you are genuinely mentally fatigued, what aspects of the recovery process can you influence, and what kind of things can you do that will actually start to restore these these markers of mental fatigue?
Yeah, I think I think people will naturally behave in a way, hopefully, that helps them recover. Things like people might not want to be as like socially stimulated and engaged following, and they might therefore naturally, withdraw and spend, time in their own space. But something that I always find like it's not hilarious, it concerns me, but like the amount of athletes that are doing a physical recovery protocol, like in an ice bath or with normal whatever, and they're just on their phone looking at flicking between various social media apps, like straining their brain in a way that I'm like, do you know what I don't know, we need to do more research. I'm not saying definitely, but I would assume that we're having an impact on our ability to physiologically recover because we're also straining your brain still cognitively in that way. So why are we not, either exposing yourself through watching a video of a natural environment? All the athletes love going to the beach for recovery. Well, why can't we do that, potentially virtually, or encouraging them to listen to music that they find calming and restorative? And that there is some studies which have some evidence around certain frequencies of music which might help that. And it's like avoiding that additional cognitive stimulus whilst they're physically recovering might help them recover overall better.
You're talking about some things like the binaural sound? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and also just music that people find like calming and beneficial basically to their personal state. Like, yes, like I am in terms of the research papers talking about that area, but I do think that like they're probably better off putting music on and putting their phone away, and they need something to keep their brain stimulated than sitting there flicking through. And I understand, there's media obligations, there's money that come out of social media contracts, like there's ethical considerations there too, but getting someone to manage that. Do you need to be doing that in the 20 to 30 minutes immediately after your game? And can someone else do that for you? Or can you outsource or pre-schedule that and see how that benefits you? And again, more research, but it's kind of that interrelation between mental and physical recovery really fascinates me, particularly, based on the need to sleep and help that cognitive restoration occur as well.
It seems like sleep is a really big factor that seems to benefit, people's performance in lots of different areas, but whether it be mental or physical as well. Is there evidence that you've seen that actually measures some of the changes that we see in the mental and cognitive load tasks with improving, say, sleep hygiene?
Yeah, I always think of it of like, if we're worrying about mental fatigue in an athlete, the first thing we should be worrying about, like before we go there, is are they sleeping well, and is that foundational base sorted? Because there's no point trying to deliberately, I don't think, cognitively fatigue or help cognitively recover an athlete if they're not getting the basic premise that we've known for years is helpful in that space. So it's kind of like the mental fatigue, mental recovery aspect is like an additive to the base of them getting a good foundational sleep. And again, we don't have evidence necessarily, there's theoretical evidence to sort of indicate that if the same mechanisms around adenosine accumulation, which sleep obviously releases or dissipates, are also related to mental fatigue, then our susceptibility to mental fatigue arguably is higher when we're in a sleep deprived state, right? So I guess it's the concepts of getting like that sleep basic foundation right, and then you can start to explore mental fatigue and mental recovery. And lots of the, I guess, behaviors and environmental things also would be arguably cognitively deloading. People talk about, winding down and the routine before bed. Well, that also in a way is probably helping you get direct cognitive restoration before you're even getting to sleep. So I think there's a lot more to do and achieve in that area as well.
Something we'd like to ask our guest Susie to finish up is what you're interested in or passionate about outside of your work. Is there anything in particular that you're pursuing or learning about?
Yeah, this question, I was like, what do I like doing and what am I learning? I like doing lots of things outside of work.
Apart
But
from painting fences, of course.
yeah, well, I have to say my DIY
And
skills
thinking
in the
of
last 2 years
analogies.
have really, really improved. But no, the one thing that in the last I don't know, 6 to 9 months or so that I have taken up out of interest is playing golf. And it kind of came from like a space of being fascinated by like what is cognitively like challenging about the sport and the technical and physical aspects, but also like just wanting to do something that was, I guess, restorative, in which I think people that are actually good golfers will laugh at, because I think everyone tells you it's the most frustrating game in the world. But like being outside in a space where I'm like learning a new skill that I don't have any expectations around, and just trying to, I guess, like, yeah, do some activity that I know should be good for me, but isn't as physically demanding as sort of probably the other things that I engage with. So that's, yeah, what I've been spending a little bit of my time doing. Not very successfully to date, but we're okay with at this point.
All right. I think that we won't hold you up too much longer, and we apologize for having to sort of slightly change the times there. So, Susanna, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to share your knowledge with us. It's been hugely informative.
No worries at all. Thank you for having me on. And yeah, I hope people have learned something from it. And obviously,
I'm sure
any
they have.
questions, people free to reach out. I love talking about this topic, and yeah.
I was going to say, where can people find you if they want to reach out?
Yep. I have lots of ways. I guess my email is available sort of on so I'm with ACU Sprint Research Centre. So through them you can contact me. Also through Twitter. It's just Susanna_Russell, or LinkedIn as well. People feel free to connect and reach out to me.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Susie.
Thank you.